So chapter 3 is all about the macromolecules. So chapter 2 was about chemistry, the little stuff like bonds and atoms, but chapter 3 is about the macromolecules, specifically carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So macro means big. So we're talking about things that are going to be bigger molecules. So water is a pretty small molecule. These are generally what we call polymers. So molecules that have been put together out of much smaller units. We're going to start off with the carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, these are our main fuel for organisms. Whether you are a plant or animal, doesn't matter. You are going to use carbohydrates as your fuel. So carbohydrates, when we think carbohydrates, this is what most of us think about, things like pasta and breads, and anything that contains like a starch. So what are carbohydrates made out of? So the name carbohydrate actually gives you a clue. So carb for carbo or carbon, and hydrate, to hydrate means to drink, right? And so carbohydrates are made out of carbon and water, hydrogen and oxygen. So those are the three elements that carbohydrates are mainly built out of. Pretty much every carbohydrate, that's what you're going to find. So here's glucose, you can see over here, and it's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in different numbers and combinations, but you're going to find carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. That's what's going to make up a carbohydrate. So like I said, this is primary fuel for organisms. So this is what we use to drive our engines, right? We need to eat carbohydrates in order to provide fuel for our cells. And the secondary function for carbohydrates we're going to see is structure. So some organisms like plants and things like insects and crustaceans are actually going to use different types of carbohydrates to reinforce their cells to make them stronger. So we'll see that later on. But the main function for carbohydrates is energy, for fuel. And where is the energy? The energy is going to be in the carbon-hydrogen bonds. So the bonds between the carbons and the hydrogen. So you can see there are oxygen-carbon bonds and oxygen-hydrogen bonds. You can get some energy out of those, but the main energy is going to be in these carbon-hydrogen bonds. And so these guys are going to store a lot of energy and are easily broken by organisms compared to the other ones. And so that's what the energy is going to be harvested out of for the carbohydrates. So then the question is, what kind of bonds are these? If you're going to be building a large macromolecule or polymer, it needs to be really strong, right? So what type of chemical bond from our previous lectures would you think would work best for building macromolecules? Covalent bonds, ionic bonds, or hydrogen bonds? And if you said covalent bonds, that is the correct answer here. Because remember, covalent bonds are the strongest of these three bonds because they're sharing those electrons. And so if you're going to build a big molecule, just like if you're going to build a big building, you want to have the strongest materials and strongest structures that you can. And so you're going to use the strongest glue. And here our strongest glue is the covalent bond. Right? Remember, ionic bonds are strong, but not as strong as a covalent bond. So, who are the carbohydrates? So, like I said, we always think of foods that contain carbohydrates, but there are specific carbohydrates that we always are going to be looking for that organisms use. So, carbohydrates break down into two groups. So the first group is the simple sugars, or what are commonly called monosaccharides, mono for one. And so these are just single sugar units that we can then build into the bigger, more complex sugars that we're going to see later. So we've got glucose. Glucose is the most common of the carbohydrates. Fructose. So if you think fructose, it sounds a lot like fruit, and it is the common monosaccharide that is found in fruits. Right? That's part of what makes them sweet. And then we've got galactose. And galactose is one of the monosaccharides that's put together into different disaccharides, two sugars, all right, to make a more complex sugar, to just create different types of sugars. Now you'll notice all three of these monosaccharides have the same chemical formula. They're all 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. But if you look at the stick pictures of them up here, and then just the general drawings of them down here, they're not identical to each other. Glucose and galactose are very similar. Right? They have the same general shape, and overall they're basically the same. There's some other differences, like you can see here, this guy points up while this guy points down. That actually makes a difference in how they taste. And this shape right here is what makes fructose taste sweet. This is why fruits taste sweet to us. If I gave you a cup of glucose and a cup of fructose to drink, you'd like the fructose because it's sweet compared to glucose, even though they're both energy molecules. So like I said, glucose, this is actually the most common of the monosaccharides. In fact, most carbohydrates are built out of it, and most carbohydrates are going to be converted into it. This is what you know as your blood sugar. So if you've ever had your sugar measured, it's measuring your glucose because that's what your body has turned it into, because that's the easiest of the sugars for your cells to use. So there's 3 different things that can happen to that glucose or that blood sugar once it's traveling around your body. One, you can use it for your immediate energy. So your body's going to take it, smash this guy apart, break down those bonds, those carbon-hydrogen bonds, use the energy to fuel your cells and make some new compounds, right? So that's the first thing that can happen. You're going to use that glucose for that. However, we usually today eat more food, especially carbohydrates, than we need. And so any of the energy you don't need immediately is going to go into storage. First, it'll go into short-term storage, which is another carbohydrate. We'll see this guy later, called glycogen. So you can see, if you squint, you might be able to notice that these are little hexagons. So it's going to be stored as glucose in strings, basically. That way, in case you need it and you don't have, you haven't eaten recently, you've got, this energy store that you can immediately grab and start using. However, if your short-term storage doesn't get used up, or you have a lot of extra glucose hanging around, it's going to actually get converted into another macromolecule altogether. It's going to get converted into a fat, which belongs to the lipid group we'll talk about later on. So this is actually a molecule that's difficult for us to use up because our bodies are built to store it for when we have problems not being able to get food, right? So these are the ones that we'd rather them have happen, but because of our lifestyles today, some of our energy, probably more than we like, gets converted into this last one. All right, so what's carbo-loading then? So it has to do with carbohydrates. So what is carbo-loading? So in the question, tell me what you know about carbo-loading. So if you're familiar with it, carbo-loading has to do with eating things like pasta. So you're going to eat things like pasta, you might eat something like rice, things like that. You're going to eat the stuff the night before you have a big, energy event that you need to use it for. So for example, you've got a marathon, you've got a big bike ride, you have an athletic event, a wrestling event, something like that. So you've got something coming up the next day that you need lots of energy for. So why are you carb loading? Well, it has to do with how the carbohydrates in this pasta, the bread, and so on work. So before we get to that, I do have a question for you. When you eat a candy bar, you're eating mostly the simple sugars, like the monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and so on. So if you eat a candy bar while watching a movie, how will your body utilize those sugars? So what will your body do with the sugars? So all of those sugars will be used immediately by your working muscles. B, the sugars will likely be stored as glycogen. C, the sugars will be stored as fat. Or D, both. That's supposed to be B and C are correct. Right. And the best answer here is D. So because you're sitting, watching a movie, I'm assuming you're not up running or something while you're watching the movie. If you are, good for you. But most of us sit and watch movies. So that means that your body is going to take that sugar from the candy bar and store it as glycogen and store it as fat because you're not doing anything to actually burn that sugar off. All right. So let's take a look now at what's going on with the carbo loading. All right, so those complex carbohydrates are basically time release packets. So any complex carbohydrate is something that has more than one monosaccharide unit. So there's two groups here. We've got disaccharides, di for two. So these are ones that are built out of two monosaccharides. So common ones that you'd know here, sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar. So this is the white stuff that you'd put in your coffee. So this is what you normally call sugar. And sucrose is made out of a glucose and a fructose stuck together. So that's why it's so sweet. And then there's lactose. This is milk sugar. So this is the sugar that's in milk. This is the stuff that some people have problems digesting. Because it is a disaccharide, it has to be broken in order to be digested. Lactose is made out of glucose. And so you need to break it apart in order to digest it. Then there are the polysaccharides. These are also complex carbohydrates. These are the ones that you carb load with because these are the ones that contain starches. So your breads, your pastas, your rice, they contain starch and they've got tons of glucose in them. They're in big long strings. We'll see that in the next slide. Other polysaccharides include cellulose. So we'll see that. And that's one of the building carbohydrates. And then glycogen. So glycogen, that is a polysaccharide. It's built out of a bunch of glucoses as your short-term storage. And so glycogen is also a polysaccharide because it's made out of a bunch of monosaccharides. So how does this work as far as the complex carbohydrates? So if you carbo load, what you're doing is you're taking something like this guy right here. So this is a polysaccharide, and they're actually hundreds of glucose molecules long. Obviously, the picture couldn't hold all of it, right? But polysaccharides have all of these glucose molecules linked together. And so when you're sleeping at night, your body is going to be breaking these apart. So it's going to chop each of these little glucoses off the starch, because the starch are in big long strings, and it's going to rearrange them into glycogen. So starch is a big long string which takes time for your body to chop up. But glycogen is branched. So your body is taking these starch molecules and reorganizing it into this guy, because this is a lot easier for your body to get energy off of, because it can take glucose off of each branch tip at the same time. So you can get energy off of all of these guys, versus if you needed energy from this guy, you'd only be able to take one from here and one from here. Right? But no matter whether they're complex carbohydrates like starch or glycogen or disaccharides, same thing's going to happen. You're going to break them off of their main molecule and then smash them to get the energy, just like you would for the monosaccharides. So what does this have to do with, as far as how we eat? Like I said, they're time-release fuel pellets. And so when you eat, if you've ever heard of, you should have a full and healthy breakfast. You'll probably see in those pictures a bowl of cereal and then like a glass of juice and bacon and eggs and all of this other stuff. But the reason why they always have some sort of cereal there is because they contain complex carbohydrates. And so if we take a look here at how they did this little experiment, what they did is they measured blood sugar after consuming orange juice, something that contains basically fructose, just monosaccharides, and then blood sugar after consuming something like oatmeal, which contains complex carbohydrates. And so take a look at what happened. So what happened after consuming just fructose to the blood sugar level? And then what happened to the blood sugar level after eating something that was made out of complex carbohydrates? So describe what happened in each of those instances. And what we see, which I'm guessing you described, is that the blood sugar level spikes fairly quickly with monosaccharides, which makes sense. Your body can smash those really easily. And then it crashes, right? Versus complex carbohydrates, where the blood sugar level increases slowly over time and then stays steady. This is why it's recommended that you eat something that contains complex carbohydrates for breakfast, because your blood sugar level will stay steady until you make it to your next meal. All right, so we'll stop there and pick up with the rest of the carbohydrates with things that are not digestible. Up to this point, we've talked about the digestible carbohydrates, and then talk about our next group, the lipids.